Shane Kanto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to the Wasteland, where this is my weekly show where I take a deep dive into a particular film, and we're getting into the thick of it with some of John Ford's most famous films, as we're going to be talking about Fort Apache. And joining me for this episode is my buddy Joe. Joe, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome, man.
Leading over from the movie club here to talk about another film, which we're all to be recording tomorrow. As we talk about a different movie, obviously, for our movie club. That would be interesting. Pick the same thing for the same month. But no, for this show, we have three segments. So we do have our coming attractions for the weekend of June 28th as we wrap up June here. And we have Fort Apache, our feature film, and then some recommendations for you. Now, this last weekend of June has some smaller films coming out, like Daddy-O. Then we have a new reunited Nicole Kidman and Zac Efron for the new Netflix rom com, where I think that it was a Paperboy that they wound up doing like 11 years ago or something like that. And Kevin Costner has his big like dream project of Horizon, an American saga, in two parts, which are both apparently over 3 hours. So that's fun. But I think Joe and I are on the same page. Joe, what are you most excited
Well, believe it or not, a movie coming out that I'm kind of looking forward to is The Quiet Place Part One or Day One.
about? Day
Uh,
one.
I like the franchise. I know the second movie, it's not nearly as talked about as the first one is. I really
Mm-hmm,
think it was such a strong effort
mm-hmm.
from John Krasinski, but in a way where I think and this that maybe be a hot take, but like him and Jordan Peele have started so strong with their first
Yep.
movies that the movies that come afterwards are good. They're not as good as Get Out, and they're not as good as A Quiet Place, but they're good movies. But at the same time, too, like I said, they're really good films. Like I haven't seen If yet, so I can't have an opinion on that. But as far as this world that he built in The Quiet Place, I'm just really hyped because one, it's an alien invasion movie set in New York City. We've seen that done before. We've seen it done a million times. If
Yep.
anything, it's a trope, right?
Mm-hmm.
Alien invasion movies take place in two populated cities, San Francisco or New York City. You're going to see the Golden Gate Bridge in some way, shape, or form get attacked, or you're going to see the Empire State Building get attacked in
Yep.
some way, shape, or form. But because this franchise relies on noise and aliens that are impacted by noise. Listen, I was born in Staten Island. I lived in New York my whole life. I mean, not my whole life, obviously. My childhood was New York. I don't know why I said that.
Mm-hmm.
New Jersey, I think, sometimes falls into that territory, but that's a whole conversation for a different time. It's a noisy place. So you have these aliens, and it's like when I saw the trailer, I'm like, they're setting a quiet place in New York City with Lupita Nyong'o. Am I saying her name right?
Yep.
And with her as the lead actress, I'm like, sign me up. I will watch that.
Yeah, so I think originally this was supposed to be directed by Jeff Nichols too,
Okay.
who did has done like Mud and the Bike
Okay.
Riders that came out the week before this. This one is directed by Michael Sarnowski, who did the movie Pig with
Oh.
Nick Cage. So, which that movie is one of Nick Cage's best films
Yeah.
in the past like probably 20 years. Um, being gracious about the timeline there. But this film, you're right, it's such a great concept. The concept of a quiet place is such a great concept. And, we experienced it like hundreds of days already into this experience. And now we get to see how people reacted. Because, like, that opening scene of A Quiet Place Part 2 was like, this is a cool idea of actually seeing how people like react to this. And you're
Yeah.
right, New York is loud AF, and
Yes.
it's gonna be freaky to watch because like I cannot imagine that this is gonna have anything short of complete slaughter
Yeah.
of people, and
Yeah.
it's gonna be terrifying. And even the
Yeah.
trailer's terrifying, to be honest. And Lupita Nyong'o, Joseph Quinn, who's riding high off of Stranger Things, who's also going to be in the Fantastic Four. So he's going to be in this. And it looks like Dainjin Hansu, who had a very small part in part two. We actually
Yeah,
get to see more of him in this film, which is interesting. But
yeah,
yeah, it's a and these are like nice and lean kind of horror films because like this looks like just an hour and 40 minutes. So like
right.
it you don't stretch it out too long and there's gonna be some freaky stuff that's gonna happen. So we'll have to see. The last one did really well for itself for Memorial Day weekend during the pandemic
Yeah,
because that came out in 2021 and
yeah,
was one of the first movies to legitimately make money.
yeah.
So I'll be interested to see because unless the dads all rally together and go out and see Kevin Costner's new Western, I just don't know how well that one's gonna do.
I get the
Um,
impression that it's going to be like The Postman in some ways, where it's like he has this passion project, but it's mostly just being a long, overdrawn passion project. Like we need to stay away from 3 hour movies. I think
like
an hour.
I don't have anything wrong with length of movies, but when you tell me that you are trying to tell a story that you had to cut in two halves that are over 3 hours apiece, and it's a Western in 2024, it just kind of screams vanity project to
Oh,
me.
100%. 100%.
And we'll have to see how that goes. But I
Yeah,
predict A Quiet Place Day One's going to do pretty well for itself.
yeah.
Because also, there's nothing big between Bad Boys, Ride or Die, and A Quiet Place Day One. There's nothing for adults that's like in the month of June. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes because obviously, Inside Out 2 is going to be killing it throughout the month of June. And all them families getting there.
Mhm.
Now, for our feature film, so this is the 1948 Western Fort Apache. This is indeed starring Henry Fonda, who has been in quite a few John Ford films up to this point, and John Wayne, who has become synonymous with John Ford Westerns in Legacy. This is actually the first of a trilogy of cavalry trilogy films, which wraps up with I'll be doing He Wore a Yellow Ribbon next. So like that's another one of the films. So this has like an unofficial trilogy of films that John Wayne starred in for John Ford. This was inspired by James Warner Bailey's short story Massacre, which the short story in turn was actually based off of Custer's Last Stand at Little Bighorn,
Yeah.
which you certainly feel that when you watch this movie. This is one of the first films with authentic and sympathetic Native American characters in it. So
Hmm.
it's like, hey, look, the Native Americans weren't the assholes in this movie. Henry
No.
Fonda was, which also was a twist because usually it's
Well,
not Henry Fonda.
yeah, like I was very surprised seeing Henry Fonda, who I've just always associated as like the voice of reason in like Grapes of Wrath and
Yep,
12 Angry Men, as being a straight up dick.
he was he was a dick
It's
because
stupid.
he is the Custer
Oh
of
yeah.
the story. It's a man who's so far up his own ass when it comes to order and doing things his way. And the whole entire main conflict in the climax of this film happens out of his own ego.
Narcissism.
Yep. And it didn't have to end this way,
No.
but he's just like, well, we're gonna do this. And but we'll get to that. But Joe, what are
Yeah.
your general thoughts on the film?
You know what's crazy? Because like the last John Ford movie we saw, the Stupid Steamboat movie, I can't. It's not even comparable to how I feel about this movie because to me I was like maybe there's something there maybe, but that movie was just either it's a product of its time or that it just you know it just didn't work on a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So watching Fort Apache was very fascinating because one, it's like what 20, 30 years later after that movie, the technology has gotten better, cinematography has gotten
Yeah,
better.
probably at this point. So
Yeah.
since we talked about that film, it probably is like a good 20 years after.
So a lot has definitely changed. Like
Hmm.
storytelling wise, I'll say my criticisms first when
Okay.
watching the movie because the only thing And this did also happen, and maybe it's just a storytelling back in the day, where I felt like two movies are going on at the same time, where you have a love story between
Hmm.
romantic leads, which is so weird. We're talking about like characters that you don't normally see being playing as certain characters, like Henry Ford, um, Henry Fonda, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
I've called him Henry Ford
I know. I keep.
so many times through these episodes. No,
Um, we'll just say
Henry
Thursday.
Fonda, and
Yeah,
like Shirley Temple's in
Shirley
this movie,
Temple.
and he's like not a kid,
No.
which is funny because another little side note: the actor who plays her love interest in this is a real life husband.
Aw.
So like they were actually married, and then I'm like, Shirley Temple was old enough to get.
I know.
Because like you just have like in your head like it's Shirley Temple. She's this little
It's the
girl. But
mannerisms too. It's the way she acts. It's so childish, and it's like I'm gonna do the thing that most. It's like when Macaulay Culkin. It's the Macaulay Culkin shtick where it's like a little kid acting like an adult. But guess what? Now that she's an adult, it it shouldn't be childish, but it still feels childish because she did it as a
yeah,
child. It's weird.
and and also award for most interesting name, Philadelphia Thursday.
From Massachusetts.
Yeah, there's a whole entire gag about how she got her name in Philadelphia. But
Exactly.
no,
Yeah.
like yeah, it there's a lot of films, especially at that time, that felt like today. A lot of films, it's like it has to feel like you need to throw in a love story, and it's just like, let's do this.
But it
Um,
doesn't. Even the gags, right? Like even the comedy bits with Thursday, right? Like him falling into the chair, or even like the wordplay. It was like they're going into like Three Stooges type of
mhm.
humor. And to be honest with you, if this were made to, you know what it's kind of comparable to? It's like 50 First Dates in a way, where you have a very serious movie, serious subject matter that they could go straight up drama, even like A24 type drama. But it's like, nope, we have an identity. We have a shtick. People want this. To me, it's like the studio is just like, you know what? People are just not going to buy a sympathetic Native American movie straight off the bat. We need to give audiences what they expect.
Well, and it's very old school Hollywood where it's like you got a little romance, got to have a little silly humor in it.
Yeah.
And I feel like Victor McLaughlin, who was like the Irish sergeant, I feel like he was some fun comic
Yeah.
relief on some level. And like, sure, they made jokes about him drinking and stuff like that because, like, he's Irish. But like, it's still stereotypical. But I feel like that kind of humor still works. And when they were focusing really completely on the romance, is when the film got a little slower, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah.
And the much more compelling aspect of this film is Lieutenant Colonel Thursday coming into the fort and reshaping all the culture of that. Because you
Mm,
have Captain Kirby York, who's John Wayne's character, who, oddly enough, is the voice of reason and being like, these Native Americans have been treated like crap for years. And I'm like, why are these characters not switched?
isn't it weird? I want to. I mean, let's address the elephant in the room. That the voice of reason that's sympathetic to the Native Americans is the same guy that would try to charge up to a Native American at the Academy Awards.
Yep. There's a bit of irony there.
Bit of
Um,
a
which
smidgen.
I'll give credit because both these actors did a really good job. I feel like Henry Fonda was so good as a stiff upper lip dickhole of a lieutenant colonel, and it's like the facial hair, his cold demeanor, and his intensity. Because it's so interesting because this was years before Once Upon a Time in the West, where he really played a true villain, um, which scared and threw everybody off. And that was the whole entire point was like Frank, them showing like this man who just murdered a child is Henry Fonda. And here it's interesting because he's a complex character where like you can see people who would still think like he's the hero of the story in the same way that, US history still puts Custer as a hero of his story. And it's just American context, and that's what's so interesting watching this film. What this is what 76 years ago?
1948.
Yeah, 1948. So this is almost 80 years ago, and this film even was being like questioning. It's like, yeah, that wasn't right. It's just like, wow, this seemed like a very interesting time to be taking that like Custer Last Stand mythos and being like, yeah, Custer was the dick in the situation, and just these Native Americans, which they had every right to be mad because the guy that was running the checkpoint who was supposed to be taking care of them was stealing from them, forcing alcohol on them, and treating them like trash. And like, there's that whole entire sequence in this film at that trading post where there's some serious conversations and the and interactions there. I'm like, wow, this film's really going
Yeah, like it's crazy too because like the whole plan, right? They
there.
flee to Mexico, and the only reason why they want to bring them back is to handle the renegades that still stayed there and are
Yeah.
attacking their troops, just so that they can calm them down in a sense. But the reality is, it's like, nah, we're just gonna keep them under our thumb now and do the exact same goddamn thing that guy they had sent in there do, which
Mhm.
again, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you.
Yep.
Like in that time, they've developed like even before going into this movie, we're dealing with Apaches. We know based on history that the Apache tribe is a really intense tribe between them and the
Manti.
the Comanches. They're the straight up, you know, they're the warriors, man. Like that's what's so crazy about this. And they're like, nah, you're making them seem like they're, smarter or they know things like Alexander the Great. It's like they kind of do.
And that's so interesting because like Captain York's whole entire function in the climax of the film is to be like, I wouldn't do that. And Henry Fonda's like, yeah, see me do that. And they do it. And God, that whole entire sequence is intense and thrilling and set up where it's like, they're bottlenecking themselves into this valley. And like, you're lining yourselves up for slaughter. And that's exactly what happens. And it's intense, it's frightening, and you have that like hard of horses come by and leave nobody left. And you're just like, damn. And it's just like this didn't need to happen.
Nope. And the crazy thing about that too, though, is like, um, it really shows how much of a villain. Like I'm just gonna say Tuesday is a villain. Like I think he's an antagonist. He is a straight
Yep.
up antagonist. Where that moment where you see him get hit by a bullet, like actually, that's I want to say stung, but it actually felt like this guy had it coming. Like
Yep.
he knew, he didn't know, but we all knew. Like it's dramatic irony, and
Mhm.
and that to me is why that moment, like it's so short, but it's like exactly who he is. So there's a lot that you kind of like as you're watching it. It's I had to watch it in subtitles just to make sure I'm catching like all the things that they're saying because I think back then cinema audio wise, when it comes to
Mhm.
like boom mics were not as good as they are today. So I wanted to make sure I read and heard
Yeah.
everything they were saying. Like to me to have that really stick out like a gunshot, literally and figuratively, really shows just you know how much you're really siding for the natives in this one. Like they got screwed
Mhm.
historically and in this movie. They just got screwed.
Well, and they obviously wanted peace. They just wanted to be respected. And like the leader of the Apache getting upset because he just wanted to be respected was enough disrespect for Thursday to be like, hell no.
I
It's just
literally
like,
gasped.
I'm just
Like I
like,
literally gasped,
serious.
and when I saw him walk away, I'm like, I would do the same thing.
And like they portrayed Cochise, the leader of this tribe, as a strong, reasonable leader. He wanted to go there and negotiate. And you can tell Thursday had no interest.
They
And
traveled
York,
from Mexico. That's a far ride.
yeah. And York finally calming things down by the end. And even like the final scene of the film where it's setting up that like, oh, the great things that Thursday did, riding off into glory and death, and York like, yeah, sure. And basically it's like
But
he
it's the
knows.
soldiers. It's the soldiers, and I like how they included that bit. It's actually a very well shot
Mm-hmm.
moment. I know this is
Yep.
gonna sound dorky since I've been getting back into baseball a lot more, and
Mm-hmm.
the whole idea of like the Yankees not putting the nameplates on the back of their jerseys because it's the team that's strong, whereas the soldiers, yeah, you might remember their names, but that's not the point. It's the battle. It's what they're fighting for. That's what takes up the precedence, which is ironic, but also it's nuanced, right? Because York was not thrilled with what happened, but at the same time, too, they're so far into this that he has to put on face, right?
Yeah.
So he's still trying to show that as troops, and that's I guess what a lot of John Wayne movies do is like they're very patriotic and they're very much like
Mm-hmm.
supporting the troops and whatnot. Like it's about showing that the soldiers are really people
Yeah.
defending something and fighting something. And in some ways, so were the Apaches too. But again, that's just what makes this movie so
Well,
interesting.
and a lot of the time it's just the quote unquote brunt that pay the price for their leaders that are making these decisions. And you're right, York doesn't really have the power or authority to question the legacy of what Thursday is going to be remembered for.
Mm-hmm.
But he just has to like try to be respectful of his troops. And when he has the power to make decisions, do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do the right thing, Western version, which
Oh
is just
wow,
like it's like, yep, Lieutenant Colonel
John
Thursday
Wayne
certainly
of
did
all
not do
people.
I do think it's very interesting that John Wayne was the character because like if you were to tell me who was going to be the like xenophobic, ignorant, stubborn, and aggressive person in this situation, and who was going to be the calm, cool, and respectful counter to that, and you told me John Wayne and Henry Fonda were in this movie, I'm like, well, that's easy, but that's not what it was.
Yeah.
And I feel like you needed somebody like Henry Fonda to play Thursday to reinforce the power and the legacy of what, say, Custer's Last Stand would mean. Like, you can't just, like, you needed somebody who was like, yeah, looking back, I would respect him. It's that iconic iconography of like the idea of casting someone like Henry Fonda, who everybody respects and sees in this role, makes it more impactful. And also shows that like Henry Fonda had a lot of range as
Yeah.
an actor. One of the greatest actors
He has
ever.
some of the best acting when it comes to his eyes. Like he can emote
Mhm.
so much when it comes to his eyes. Like to me, that's what I loved about him in 12 Angry Men. That's what I loved about him in Grapes of Wrath.
Yep.
And here it's the same thing too. He emotes and he uses his
Mhm.
eyes, and the
It's
it's
fantastic.
it's fantastic.
Like those eyes just sitting up on
They
that
do.
like facial
They
hair that he
pierce.
has in this movie.
It's the
Which
joke with Daddy's Home too, where Mel Gibson's eyes are piercing Will Ferrell's soul. It's the same thing with Peter Henry Fonda.
exactly. Well, that's the thing. Very charismatic actors and powerful actors can leverage that. And Henry Fonda was one of the best. And it's interesting because like, and John Wayne is not was not an actor known for his depth and range of acting. And I will also say, and this is my favorite Don Ford film, is The Searchers. Like that's his strongest performance. I
Yeah.
know he won his Oscar for playing Rooster Cogburn, which was showier for sure.
Yeah.
But like this film is really well put together. It's really well shot. There's plenty of there's a surprising amount of dancing. There's a lot of like that. They captured the military life a lot in this film because you had a
Yes.
lot of like the balls and stuff like that, and everybody decked out in their uniforms and stuff like that. And I think the first two acts, outside of like the romance part, when it's focusing on the military aspects, does a great job of looking at that harsh balance between like when you have somebody reasonable in charge and balancing it versus like an iron fist coming down. And there's that tension. And I think that was interestingly well done in the film as well.
Yeah. See, that's the problem when it comes to like certain leaders, right? Like when it comes to, having a leader that is not necessarily right, but they're so commanding and will get
Mm-hmm.
people in line and straight when it comes to like what they're doing. But the problem is a lot of the times they're going to send you into battle, but they're probably going to send you into battle for the wrong reasons, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the importance of having a character like Thursday, in a sense that, it is easy for people to cling on or see them as this hero because of what he portrays himself. Kind of a strong message now when we look in the post-Trump, world where people just blindly follow the guy based on, oddly enough, charisma, and then until you actually read deeply into, or you don't even need to read deeply into what he's saying. He just outright says bigoted stuff and just puts it out there. But guess what? It's charismatic for some people. Like it's kind of
Well,
the same
and
thing.
it's that false prophet idea of like people will believe what's told to them, even if like you can witness what really happened, or you can hear from those who were there, or in today's context, look at a clip where it's like this person literally said this, but because they said I never said that. Well, no, he would never have said that. It's just like, but it's one of those kinds of things where it's like we still have that issue almost 80 years later in terms of like there's a mythos that's created, there's a cult of personality that's created around people, and people will believe it blindly. And and it's even an interesting point today that this film at the end is really about reframing history
Yeah,
and protecting those who did bad things.
yeah.
And today, there's a large amount of people who want real history, who really want to see how things are, and then an equal amount of people who get offended that you would even question the idols that they had because they want to continue to believe the mythos that was created and not the actual truth.
Listen,
So
you want to see a hamburger made, you got to go to the factory. Sometimes you got to go you got to go see the slaughterhouses if you want to see how a hamburger's made.
it's just like I love my chicken McNuggets. You know how those chicken McNuggets are made?
Let me tell you
I
about
don't.
pizza lunch.
It's it's such an interesting film with such an impactful ending that's just like this has a lot of things that you can think about today that
Yeah.
humanity still struggles with.
And it's interesting because now that we're talking about it, and it's a little fresh in my mind, right? When it comes to the amount of dancing that's shown in this movie, in a weird way, do you think that this is juxtaposed to Native American culture and water dances and rain dances?
Well, and that's an interesting thing because like if you were to actually because like this film's sympathetic to Native Americans, but it never really shows them as people.
Mm-hmm.
You never see their culture and stuff like that. We have a lot more in common. Like the military experience like that. Like we're gonna have a dance before like the big day tomorrow. They're probably doing their own kind of thing like that, except ours is quote unquote refined and classy because
Yeah.
we're all done up in our dress blues and we're doing like very generic line dances.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I was
Like
watching a documentary on the Aztecs, right, and why the Aztec conquest was not nearly as bad as the Native American conquest in a sense that culturally the Spanish are similar to the Aztecs, and instead of there was still a superiority complex there, but after a while, it's like you're not much different from us. Yes, we have more resources that led us to create certain things and may have caused us to maybe progress, whereas your environment didn't cause you guys. But if you had the same environment as us and you had the same resources as us, you would have done probably you probably would have been cyberpunk, Aztecs by the time we were in the Renaissance. And they recognized that. Like even going back to the whole in the beginning of the movie, when it comes to the dance that they were celebrating for George Washington, it's very traditional for Native Americans to have celebrations when it comes to their ancestors. Like it's a subtle, if this movie were remade today, there would be more juxtaposition. There would be more illustrations over how their society is pretty much the same as ours.
I would expect probably if you made a western today about this story, you would actually have cross cutting back to the
Yeah.
Native American life because that's one thing that this film does not do is they do not like you don't see the Native American characters until you need to see them. It's 100% from the fort perspective, and you never see the Native American perspective. You just have basically you have that one interaction with Cochise, and you have John Wayne's character York telling us why like they're reasonable people and that
Mm-hmm.
they've been done to.
Mm-hmm.
But Joe, do you have anything else to add about Fort Apache?
Yeah, there's a lot actually.
Go ahead.
There's a lot actually because I actually wrote this down while watching the movie.
Mhm.
An hour and 38 minutes into the movie where they're getting ready to not necessarily fight, but to have a negotiation.
Yep.
There was something about the sky being cloudy, and
Mhm.
there was something about the way the camera caused the footage to look archival. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but it actually made it feel cinematic in a way. And I wasn't sure if you caught on to that too, because they actually recycled that scene in the scene where York is looking into the window and you see that same shot and I recognize because of the way the clouds are overcast, and then you find out scene afterwards the clouds are a little bit brighter. That's why I think maybe it was unintentional, but for some reason they decided to keep it because something about the way it felt like a documentary, but it also kind of felt real. It felt gritty, and it was just a beautiful shot watching those that cavalry ride in a cloudy set.
Well, and I think that's particularly important too, is that John Ford knows how to capture
Yeah.
his environment, and they're showing off Monument Valley. And that's the thing. It's like these are a bunch of people out in the frontier who were sent there. This is not their land. Like it is America's land now, because it's been hundreds of years of us taking this land and holding on to it. But like, it's such an interesting way of like this film capturing the beauty of this landscape and realizing like this is for most people watching this film, this is going to be such an alien kind of place because like most of us don't see things like that on a regular basis. Like I look out my window and like I see some trees, I see some squirrels and houses, a train track, and a highway. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just like this is like this massive, beautiful landscape. And John Ford knows how to leverage the landscape, the nature, and stuff to really help with the storytelling. And that's an interesting perspective that you brought up about like the cloudy sky and setting up like, hey, this isn't going to look great. This isn't going to go well. There's this ominous feeling of
Yeah.
this is going to go sideways.
Yeah. Like it's interesting to because like back then, I feel like nowadays we take for granted when it comes to what cinematography is and being able to have people that do principal photography when it comes to like capturing a shot. Like back then, they had to be so particular about making sure that a scene is going to be well lit or it's either going to be
Mm-hmm.
overexposed or it's going to be underexposed. Whereas there was some underexposure here, but it works out so well that I think it was just a creative. It does feel like it was a
Mhm.
creative choice created out of spontaneity, and you do also bring up a good point too when it comes to what we experience in our own country and things that are in our backyard that do feel foreign or feel alien. Because to me, it's kind of why it's interesting that there's a focus on Irish characters, right? What it must feel like for an Irishman to be living in
In the
the old
middle of the
West,
West.
in the middle of the
Yeah.
West. Or even Massachusetts or people from the Northeast living in the old West, living in Arizona. Like that's where this
Yeah.
is taking place, in Arizona. Like it is
Mhm.
foreign, it is alien, and I think there is an intentional juxtaposition. I mean, it was goofy when Shirley Temple's like, "Oh, everything's so dirty. I'm gonna be a stereotypical woman in this age and comment on things being dirty, 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 dirty." But it's like, well,
It's part of the process of capturing, like, yeah, what, the audience is coming in with the third state. The men who are already there and their wives, it's like they've experienced this at least for a little bit, but it's all still not our experience. We're visitors in a land that wound up, we've had so long that it is our land, but it's also America's, like, United States of America is such a big country and so diverse in just, like, you
yeah,
know, there's whole states where it's like there's barely any people in it. Like Wyoming's like 10 people and 50 like cows and stuff like that. And like just experiencing that kind of look, and that's what all these great westerns out in Monument Valley was so special.
yeah. It's crazy too because like not only just like physically it does get so diverse and it's landed. I mean, the whole idea of our country is to be a reformed, like politically reformed,
Mm-hmm.
like just in its doc, in our rules. We're not supposed to have kings, right? The
Yep.
whole idea, and this is what gets debated over years for many years when it comes to that, is the idea of like a leader and a king. It's like that we stand against that idea when it comes to having that type of rulership where it is supposed to be open for everybody. Then it's interesting that this movie is touching up on things that new Hollywood would probably have, which would actually more or less go ham on. But
Mm-hmm.
seeing it in the 1940s where the Hays Code was probably more prevalent is fascinating to me, you know?
Well, yeah, and Thursday was a tyrant. He
Mm-hmm.
ruled with an iron fist, and
Mm-hmm.
that certainly adversely affected all of his soldiers and everything, and it got a lot of them killed.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And himself.
yeah, including himself.
What an asshole move for John Wayne's for York to show up and be like, "Listen, I got you a horse. We can go back there. There's going to be water. So give me your sword." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me?"
He doubled down and got that
Double
whole
down.
group of people dead, and insisted upon making a stand in the middle of that valley. Like, you're all gonna die, and they did.
It's crazy too because it kind of reminds me when I'm doing because I'm a counselor and the thing I do in
Yep.
my main job is I make people see or understand themselves or try to understand themselves. But there's some people we work with that do double down, right?
Yep.
And it is because of pride, or it is because this is comfort. This is something that I am just so used to, and the idea of me not doing this is more scary than being able to do that. Whereas for for Thursday, he just he's sticking to this idea that we are the conquerors. We own this. There like his whole thing with convincing himself that they've abandoned their post. They lived here. They're treacherous. They've abandoned where they lived. Is such a fascinating way to reframe and stick with that. But it in his seeing his character, it makes sense that that's what his warped mind would put together. You know,
Exactly.
it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. I'm glad I saw this
Yeah.
movie.
And wrapping up with this, this is one of the higher up films for me in terms of John Ford so far.
Such a
And I'm
different steamboat, dude.
yeah, the there's a stretch there where I was really regretting, doing 80 weeks of John Ford. But at least we're
Good though, because then it
getting
makes you
into
appreciate it.
well, that is true. I certainly am appreciating like this going from the 19 teens into the through the 40s now, and he made films into the 70s, so very early 70s, but still. So it'll be an interesting journey as we keep on tugging along. And next week, my wife Jess, who's actually going to be on for like the next three episodes, we're going to be doing Three Godfathers, which is another John Ford Western, which also stars John Wayne. And before we wrap up, we have some quick recommendations for you. So, Joe, what would you like to recommend to everybody?
So I've been on a comedy binge recently, and on Hulu they have a whole bunch of Adam Sandler movies. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've gone through. I've watched Waterboy again. That movie's that sticks to me so much. But the one thing I'll make my recommendation is actually is You Don't Mess with the Zohan. I'm kind of a poser hipster mentality where I at the
Mm-hmm.
time the movie came out, so many people were quoting it, so many people were talking about it, where I was just like, I don't you're making it bigger than what it actually is. So that when I actually did see it, along with watching Waterboy and 50 First Dates, I was like, you know what? I'm on an Adam Sandler binge. Let me go watch it. And let me just say, this is straight up Looney Tunes. It is a straight up Looney Tunes movie. It's
Yeah.
interesting that I'm watching it in the time of there being a big thing going on between Israel and Palestine. In some ways, it's also I don't want to say like it's silly, but it's also like back then we had this idea of figuring it out and being like, oh, we've getting closer to figuring out how things should go, and here we are. Not it's a little naive, not silly, definitely naive. But I think if you just want to watch something silly and irrelevant, like Adam Sandler, it's a random pick sometimes, but it's up there as being like one of the sillier, more enjoyable comedies, like Happy Gilmore, Billy Madison. Seeing it also done in like the age of like Jack and Jill, right? But going back to something that hits the notes like Happy Gilmore, Billy Madison, it's actually really good. I like it.
I haven't watched it in years,
Mm.
years. So it's certainly been a while. I think I watched it close to when it actually came out. But you still get those Adam Sandler comedies sometimes, and we're getting Happy Gilmore too, which I'm
Uh,
certainly excited about. When Netflix confirmed that was actually happening, I'm like, oh my god! Because like
so you
I grew up
actually eat
watching that.
breakfast? No.
No. Now I have a couple of quick recommendations here. So one new film that I watched that it'll be out in limited release is Humanist Vampire Seeking Consenting Suicidal Person. This is about a young female vampire who has a quirky family, and he's building this connection with this young man who is suicidal. And maybe their dynamic can help with each other because he's a vampire who needs blood, and he's like, I don't know if I want to live. And it's a strange, like dark fairy tale kind of romance. And it was such an interesting watch, and it's like not even 90 minutes. So it's a weird, quirky little film.
You ever hear about movies that you hear the concept of and you're like, why didn't I come up with that? That's how I felt reading that tagline. I'm like, that is that is amazing concept.
Yeah, it's like, well, he doesn't want to be here, and she needs some blood, so maybe might work out. Then I watched off of my watch list this older film called The Wind, which it does have very old school. It's like from the 1920s. It has very old school kind of gender roles and stuff like that. It's basically about this woman who's stuck out west, stuck in between like all these toxic relationships with men. But it's so fascinating because it's like out in the west, the effect with like the literal wind of the title is such a beautifully shot film, and there's a lot of emotion to it. And I just randomly watched it on YouTube, and I'm like, honestly, this is a really interesting film in terms of filmmaking and emotion. Sure, like it certainly aged from like a character dynamic standpoint, but from a filmmaking standpoint, if you love film, it's certainly interesting to watch. And then one of my films that I rewatched was Ron from Akira Kurosawa, which this movie is so epic. This is his adaptation of King Lear. It's one of his few color films because most of his films were black and white. It is gorgeous. It is epic. The staging of big battles and stuff, because this came out in 1985. So like this was still like very practical, and it is big acting. It's very showy, Shakespearean kind of way, and like the costuming and the makeup and everything is incredible. It is a thrilling, epic film. It's one of the most gorgeous films you'll ever watch. So I'll be talking about it on the Wasteland retrospective when my buddy Luke and I are going to be talking about Throne of Blood and Ron, which we talked about Throne of Blood on the movie club at one point. So
I wasn't there for that one, but going off of what you said about the film too, like, don't you love when you see good filmmaking and it's like things that don't necessarily require, the most specialist of special effects, or doesn't require, maybe back then it was a big budget to be able to do these things, but to really just appreciate when what you can do with a good set, a good camera, all the pieces just working together in artist vision, putting it onto the screen. Isn't that something? Just it's why I love it. I love when we're watching movies like that's
why
it's like
Akira Kurosawa is
oh,
quickly becoming one of my favorite directors because has made some of the most impressively directed films I've ever seen, and they're all awesome. All these samurai films in feudal Japan. It's like this is an adaptation of King Lear set in feudal Japan,
yeah.
samurai and everything. It's really awesome.
Well, it's kind of like when we were watching the movie together at your place, and they were going through the jungle, and I'm like, this is in the 50s, like
Oh yeah, we watched Rashomon, right? So good.
so
But
good.
Joe, thank you so much for coming on and talking movies with me.
Always, man, always.
And thank all of you out there for always tuning in and supporting your Wasteland review.